Hello and welcome to the Survivor's Guide to Life on KPCA Petaluma 103.3 FM. I'm Jenny Stevenson, your host, and joining me is Dr. Peter Bernstein. Today we will continue in our series on how to survive through adversity. Dr. Bernstein, or Peter as he likes to be called, is a coach and mentor with 49 years of experience helping people survive and grow through trauma, struggles, and hard times, the stuff of real life. The goal of our series is to help you discover what we've experienced, that adversity is more than a trial to endure. It can be an exciting opportunity to learn, grow, and thrive.
Yeah. And you know what? We've been doing so much talking about what we're going to talk about today. I'm all talked out already. No, actually, we have a lot of very interesting stuff that's coming up. And we have written so many articles on what we've been talking about. And interesting, we had to dust them off and take a look at them. And sure enough, they're so relevant for what we've been doing here that we want to begin to talk about those and make them available to you. Articles, am I right?
Yes.
Yeah, and honestly, you know, we do so much work and so much moves along with us that some of this good stuff just gets put to the sidelines after we really do the work on it and emphasize it for a while. And we have so much good stuff, and every time I look at it, I'm blown away by how good it is. And it reminds me of things that we've talked about, that we've written about, that we've done videos.
We did videos, we did presentations. That kind of the backstory on this today is that last week we were talking about particularly first responders and the trauma and stress that they go through and how it affects them, how it can lead to compassion fatigue and burnout, what they need to do to take care of themselves and preserve themselves. And we can review a little bit more of that in a moment. But one of the things that really jumped out at me since that time was a statistic that Sue Farron and Ron Shull of First Responders Resiliency, Inc. brought to our attention, which is, and this is a shocking statistic, that of the families of first responders, the divorce rate is 80%.
No, I found that shocking. I thought 70% was always in my mind, and I always found that shocking. But 80% is...
That's not acceptable.
Absolutely not. But understanding what caregivers go through, and first responders fall into the category of caregiver.
They're a caregiver, that's
yeah.
right.
And I'll talk about the difference in a minute, because they have their own unique...
There's a different side, yes.
Yeah, than the caregivers that are at a person's side who are dying and they're taking care of them. First responders are a little different than that, although they have the same heart. They have incredible training. They are usually very empathic people under the surface.
Yes.
And they're very responsive, extremely responsive. Only there's one difference. They're all tough guys. And then women too, because I know plenty of women that are the first responders. They're fabulous. And I know a lot of them as friends of mine. They're tough. But underneath, they're as soft-hearted and loving and caring as in a unique way. Because it's not something that you see every day, these kind of people. The caregivers, they're different. They're unique.
It's a unique calling. You've called them diamonds in the rough.
Yes, they are diamonds in the rough. We have one on our team that we love, and she is just outstanding. That's Kelly. I call her my angel, diamond in the rough, and she's incredible. And she was a first responder.
She was, yes.
Yeah, but I love them. For me, they've been always my favorite group of professionals, semi-professionals to work with, because they're so down to earth.
They are.
And in some ways, they're so flawed, just like us.
Just like us.
So I feel that talking more toward their direction falls right under the caregiving category that we've been talking about, and ways for caregivers to become aware of, to preserve themselves.
To preserve themselves and to preserve their relationships.
And
so when we were thinking about this topic and this statistic, this very troubling pattern that Sue and Ron brought our attention to, I remembered that a number of years ago we were doing something called Resilience Cafe, which was a kind of a meeting that we put together for the community to come in and talk about resilience topics. And one of the topics that we covered was relationships and trauma. And I think at the time our focus of what we were doing was more on veterans and service members, and who were coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and how were as they came home, how were their relationships with their loved ones, their family, affected by their experiences? What were the things that were going on that were troubling their relationships? What was happening for them and for the loved ones here? But this is very applicable to the experience of first responders as well. And so we dug out of the archives some of the things we wrote about relationships and trauma.
Well, it's interesting because she's got a much better memory than I do.
It's the engineer coming out.
It doesn't matter. It's great. I thank God for her, because we have so much on our plate, and I do, and she does, but she remembers a lot. But one of the things that I do remember as you're talking is we were also dealing with the Navy SEALs. Is that at the same time?
Yes.
Okay, we haven't seen any damaged or wounded Navy SEALs in a while, but we used to. Yeah. And one of the things, by the way, they are, as tough as they are, not all of them, but a lot of them, the ones that we knew, were very empathic type of people. They did a lot of things to save people. Excuse me, I have a cough. But one of the things they are true diamonds in the rough under the most horrible conditions. But so are a lot of first responders under horrible conditions.
I think one theme that goes through that is being willing to be sacrificial. Navy SEALs, first responders, medics, they're out there not for themselves, but for someone else.
And they're putting themselves on the front lines of danger to save others, to help others. I always found them pretty amazing. I liked it because they were down to earth too, and I liked that. Yeah. So I didn't have to deal with the clinical edge of them, and I liked that too. So that attitude wasn't there.
No.
Steve warned me not to talk too much today because I got another cold. Excuse me.
Yep.
This is going in my. It's a lozenge. So I hope Steve will be able to cut out most of the coughing. We'll see.
Yes.
But anyway, as you're talking, I remember now that we were dealing with the same issues. I think I remember mostly with Navy SEALs.
There was also, I remember we had a couple of people come into the practice who were returning from Iraq and Afghanistan.
That's right. We had a number of them.
having a very hard time coming back to a marriage, a relationship, and the partner here at home being just absolutely lost as to what is going on. I remember
it's really ironic. The movie I watched on TV last night after caregiving?
Oh, yeah? What was it?
It was, what's his name? We knew his twin brother, Morgan Luttrell.
Marcus.
Marcus.
American Sniper.
That's Steve? Mm-mm. No. Oh, Lone Survivor.
Lone Survivor.
Lone Survivor.
Survivor. And it's a true story of Marcus being the only survivor.
Yeah.
And it's a horrible, terrible, traumatic story.
Yes.
Interestingly, we never met Marcus, but we know his brother as a Navy SEAL who retired, and we
met him at a conference.
Mm-hmm. Good man. But when I watched that last night, I'm thinking to myself, how do these guys come back to normal living after what they've been through and what they've experienced, which is so extraordinary? Seeing in this case, all of his friends were killed. He was the only survivor. He died on the table when they finally brought him back.
Oh, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah. And but I think about it, and I know I've heard him speak at conferences. I never met him personally. But I'll tell you something. I look at that, and I'm thinking to myself, what does that do to a person's family, relationships, when they come back after going through all of that? Well, first responders go through incredible trauma themselves. They're empathic folks. They're tough. They're strong. They're on the front lines. They don't even miss a beat. They're so quick to respond. But it affects them. And You know, I know when I've trained with them, not trained them, but trained with them. I was invited to a training with them, and I was honored to be the only civilian out of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember listening to certain things about their culture that disturbed me, and some of them were friends of mine, so I know it's true. And there was built in at the culture at that time, and this may have changed. I think it has. I hope it has.
Yeah, hopefully.
But I do remember they talked about after a very bad traumatic call or whatever, and boy, did they get in on the worst of it. They all talked about going out and having a drink afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I know a lot of these first responders in that group, they didn't mean a drink. They were alcoholics. And they were also using drugs. And their relationships were a mess. Their relationships after these traumas with their team manifested trouble. There's a lot of conflicts.
Conflict in the team.
Mm-hmm. And there was also at that time a stigma about being vulnerable and being emotionally wounded. And I remember one of my friends who's a chief now. I love her. She is quite a woman. And I know her husband. He's another first responder. They're both tied into the fire departments now. One's a captain and the other's going to be a battalion chief. But you know what's interesting about it? Even during those trainings, I remember her saying, look, we can't have people be let down and be vulnerable because then they don't become, they're not reliable.
They won't
when
be
we need
reliable
them.
anymore.
So the stigma to the whole team was, this is not a safe place to be vulnerable, to let down. To me, that was a red flag, even then.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember speaking up at that and going, that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about someone becoming so ineffectual. When that happens, you have to pull them off the team anyway. We do it with caregivers.
Yeah.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about, what we talk about today is people need to learn to push the pause button. And we talk about that in other episodes. And that means at the time, you better be totally on for what's going on in the trauma. And you can't be vulnerable. But you're absorbing the trauma, either secondarily or vicariously. You're taking it on. And it has an energy to it that affects everything else you do. If these folks don't have a place to let down and get help in processing through the intensity and the energy of these traumas, it's going to affect everything in their life. And it creates problems, okay? Well, that stigma at the time, I wouldn't say it alarmed me because I know these people are good people. What it did is concern me because I'm sitting there going, boy, are they off base? Other than having somebody who's falling apart on them in the face of real traumatic situations, that's not acceptable. That would be pushing at that point, calling it push the pause button, not the pause button, the off button. Mm-hmm. There is no vulnerability.
Okay, we're going real fast here and we need to take a break. So let's stop for a moment because I think we'll kind of, when we come back, let's back up a bit because we said so much in just the last minute or so.
Okay, and I want you to back me up and I want to hear from you too. I want you to, because you know so much about this.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
You bet. You've been listening to The Survivor's Guide to Life on KPCA Petaluma 103.3 FM. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to The Survivor's Guide to Life. I'm your host, Jenny Stevenson. Our topic today is we're continuing on a bit from our last podcast in talking about the effect of stress and trauma on first responders and how it can affect resiliency. Mm-hmm. We were talking last time, reviewing just a bit about compassion fatigue, burnout, and expanding today into the effects that extreme stress and trauma can have on relationships. Just before the break, we were getting into some of the specifics of the culture around first responders. And Peter was part of a training, was invited to be part of a training, and has really good friends who are in first responders, diamonds in the rough. However, and we don't know, we hope that things have changed, but at that time, certainly, there was somewhat of a stigma against admitting that certain experiences on the front lines as a first responder would have a lasting emotional effect. That was not necessarily safe or okay to admit.
It was the same stigma we saw with the Navy SEALs. Remember, we had to be really, we diffused so much of our, at that time, we learned a lot about, forget about calling me Dr. Bernstein unless they were really caught up in that. Some of them wanted to. But we really had to, we had to find some way to decompress the edge, the clinical edge. We didn't want that to go on. But one of the things we found with Navy SEALs is they saw vulnerability as a threat and a weakness.
Yeah.
And to them, that was dangerous.
I think at that point, one of the things, that was when we really learned to stop calling it PTSD.
That's right.
And call it PTS, because justifiably so, the SEALs felt that their experience and what happened to them was not a disorder, that was part of the stigma.
Do you remember how many of them would correct us on that? I remember we went to a conference with them, and that was a big issue. We agreed with them, and I still do.
Yes.
Now, I know the world of psychiatry doesn't, but that's not, it doesn't, excuse me, that doesn't faze me. What really is important is the frontline work and what we can do to be there at their side and get them through these difficulties. If the stigma is that intense, then I think it's up to us to diffuse it. It's up to us to find ways to diffuse it. There's also misunderstandings that we ran into, too.
Yes, you were just going into those before our break, and I'll just give a quick picture. We were talking about how it can be interpreted as being, from someone who's been a first responder who's been affected by a particularly stressful call and has lingering emotional effects from it, that can be interpreted by their team as that they're maybe not reliable anymore. That they may not be as strong or will not be strong in the moment when they're needed. It can lead to, you said, conflicts, and first responders end up feeling like they don't have a safe place to work through some of these things.
That's right. And I know, excuse me, I know that I've run into that in police departments. I know a fellow that was a detective that had to leave after many years because he did have PTS. I remember it, and but he couldn't express it when he did. He became kind of a person to stay away from. I remember.
Almost like someone who has an infectious. Almost that feeling of, if I get too close to this, I may end up going that way too.
He was treated that way, and he did have PTS. I know him, so it's not that that's not an issue, because if it comes out in the wrong ways, I mean, it definitely can interfere with his effectiveness. With the guy I'm thinking of, I bet you it did. I wasn't there, but what anyway, Steve's phone is talking, and he's the one who's always telling. Our producer is always throwing up the signs
with his phone.
Yeah, and his phone is talking.
Okay.
So I'm losing my train of thought.
He's turning red. I think we can leave him alone now.
Okay.
Okay.
Anyway, what was I saying?
We were talking about how when one member of a team of first responders, policemen, starts to feel kind of affected, the others can go like, I don't want to get, he's sick, I don't want to go there.
He was treated that way, and I know he was.
Yeah.
And I remember he did need help. I know him to this day, he still needs help. But the way he was ostracized, and people began to avoid him and treat him differently, added to the problem. I don't know, I wasn't there to know if he became so dysfunctional he wasn't reliable anymore. I don't know. But I do know he wasn't worked with, and that's left him damaged. I know it has. He's got a certain sense of shame now about that. And but we saw it, we've seen it before. It's not like this is anything new. You know what I do remember? I think Steve and I went to a conference. It was with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I can't remember where it was, but it was in San Francisco. It was a military conference. Was it Marines? I can't remember.
You're talking about Brain at War?
Was it Brain at War?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what I remember? They were doing a lot of work, and I know the SEALs adapted to some of it, where they were going to emphasize the need for mental health support and all of these things. And I was listening, And it was almost right out of the book. And it was putting me off, to be honest with you. But the overall is they were going to dictate in some ways, now we're going to take a new approach. We're going to be open and we're going to emphasize mental health and support for PTS and yada yada. And I remember thinking, no, I just was at a Navy SEAL conference, and I'm sure this information never got there because they wouldn't buy it for a minute. And I remember talking to a guy who was a retired general who was in the Joint Chiefs. He said, you know what he said to me? Oh, the SEALs are different. This doesn't apply to them. And I'm thinking to myself,
Yeah.
That's a problem right there. Something's wrong. And you can't, it's very hard to change a culture.
Very hard.
Very hard.
Yeah.
And you can't just dictate the kind of change we're talking about. I know that first responders have a culture that's not that different.
And as Sue and Ron that we were mentioning earlier, they said that that culture is still somewhat in place.
Right, and they're doing a lot of new work to take the sting out of it too. In fact, we hope to even take more of the clinical sting out of it.
Yeah.
But I hope they're right. To be honest, I don't think it's an easy job to take. I know too many first responders. They're good people, the ones that I know. But boy, there's certain attitudes that are embedded in them. And it's kind of hard to change that. I think I know it needs to be changed.
Mm-hmm.
I know our concepts of pushing the pause button, pushing the on button when it's okay to be open and vulnerable, and pushing the off button, which means there is no way for any vulnerability right now. It's too dangerous. That those concepts are not just concepts. They're applicable in real life.
They're skills.
They're skills that have to be learned. The pause button is the most important. Excuse me. The reason is because it's a way for folks to know at the time you can't be wide open and vulnerable. And if you're hurting, you better put it aside. There's things that are demanding your attention, and they're dangerous. There's emergencies, there's crises, and whatever your problems are, put them aside. But don't ignore them. Don't avoid them and pretend they're not there, because on this kind of work, you can't avoid being triggered. You can't avoid absorbing the energy of these challenging, very intense situations. Anybody who thinks they can they're living in a delusion. You can't. But you got to know how it's affecting you when it's happening. You got to know that your body's absorbing this energy and these things, and that you're going to have to deal with it, or it's going to have a cumulative effect to eventually lead to compassion fatigue, which everybody gets. To the worst one is burnout.
It'd be burnout.
And I have seen more first responders burn out. They start getting injuries, get sick. Cancer is very common in first responders.
Yes, that was another thing.
There's a very high
the chronic disease is another very high risk for first responders
compared to the general population. It's
yes,
much higher.
That's what we've heard too.
The drinking. I have seen it enough times to see it just begins to accelerate, and they're not just going out for a drink. They're drinking anytime they can. They're drinking. And I see how I've seen good friends of mine deteriorate, and it's broken my heart, because we're talking about good, effective, important people. Not on the hierarchy, but frontline value.
Yes.
Oh, they're very valuable.
And what we're kind of seeing through all of this, we talked about the pause button and not the off button, which would be to be just totally shut down, disconnected from your feelings. And in that role, it would be to not care about the people that you're there to serve. And that's not where first responders want to be, but that is where you end up in burnout, is you stop caring. And to intervene before you get to that point. And one thing I do hear in all the things that we were talking about is this effort to control these overwhelming feelings and sensations that come up from the experience,
right.
The intense experiences that first responders go to, the horrific accidents they can be called to, the tragedies for families, for children, for what they see. I get it that they come back home or they come back to the station, and what they are left with is an incredible emotional burden.
And exhaustion.
And exhaustion, physical exhaustion and emotional burdens. And how can they talk about it? If they don't want to, how can they instead control it so that it stays under wraps?
That's a good question. But you're talking about something that we've talked about before with caregivers of all kinds.
Yes.
Is that feeling of powerlessness that we finally come up against, is that we're involved in such overwhelming situations that we don't always have answers for, and we can't overcome what's coming at us. It's so intense. It's traumatizing. And when that kind of thing happens, we need to speak for all caregivers, not just for first responders. That's when we run into ourselves, because most of us are there because we want to be impactful and effective in helping others. And we're running up against a lot of situations where we may not be able to, or the situations are so dire, we can only do so much. So that sense of powerlessness, we all run into it. It kind of levels us, and it throws us back on ourselves. And that's the hard part, because then we have to look at ourselves and the pain that we carry personally, the pain of other traumatizing situations we may have worked with or been involved with in our own lives. I don't know too many caregivers and first responders that haven't had their own personal traumas.
You're bringing in a new topic, and so I'm going to say let's do a break and come back to that.
Sure.
You've been listening to the Survivor's Guide to Life on KPCA Petaluma 103.3 FM. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to the Survivor's Guide to Life. I'm your host, Jenny Stevenson. In our last segment, and again, we are talking about first responders and the emotional burdens and physical exhaustion that they can feel through their work, how important it is for them to be able to have these skills that we're talking about, to push the pause button when they are on the line, and their emotions and what is right in front of them can be overwhelming, but then how essential it is for them to come back and work through, deal with some of those emotions. Just before our break, Peter, you brought in another aspect to this, which is this feeling of powerlessness in the face of tragedy that a caring, compassionate caregiver or first responder feels. How they wish they could make things turn out differently, and they can't. And they want to help, and they're thrown back on themselves, you said, and then up can come their own pain.
And I'll tell you something, the pain is excruciating. When you're in that vulnerable place of feeling powerless, you're also feeling defenseless, or less defended than normally. And I'll tell you something, the pain is unbearable. That is the truth. Emotionality, the emotional component to these things is unbearable. And we know because we help people recover from trauma. At our institute, we work with people all the time. We know how to do it. We know how to teach people how to do this. Excuse me. But when I think about it, and I realize the kind of pain these folks carry, it's one of the core of this show, and that is we want to help you. We want to offer you tools and hope that you can get through it. The problem, what I see, is a lot of people turn to drinking and drugs, and also they turn on their relationships, personal relationships, and they do a lot of damage. And that's the sad part, because sometimes by the time we're brought in, it's too late to restore families. Sometimes they're just, damage has been too much. A lot of times we have been able to be effective, but not always. So, excuse me, I'm taking my cough drop. We want to let people to know, we want them to be aware that these things can be addressed. You started the show today by talking about families and relationships, and I think I remember now the videos that we've done on it and how impactful they are when I listen to them again.
Yeah.
I think it's a very relevant issue. We've written papers on it that we have available to people. First responders divorce rates are 80%.
Yeah, that is.
Can you imagine the
shocking.
kind of pain and destructiveness that has been acted out to cause that kind of statistic?
Well, it could be that, or it could be a withdrawal, an unavailability from this partner coming home. I can imagine, as a first responder, that they would come home from something horrible, and in their maybe even in the best interest of their family, they feel like, I'm not going to put this on my family. I don't want them to know the horrible things I've gone through. They aren't equipped to handle it, or I can't talk about this. And they end up isolating themselves, cutting themselves off. Another thing we talk about is that when we don't want to feel pain, we tend to take control and not feel anything.
We don't want to feel anything.
If we feel anything, we will feel that pain.
Well, you said a lot of times it goes through their minds and our minds. And I won't claim this for myself because I don't do this anymore, and I haven't for years. We don't want to burden our partners. We don't want to burden our families.
Right.
I'll tell you what it really has come out to most of the time. We've seen it in work. It's we don't want to deal with the pain that we're carrying and have to face that.
Yes.
That's really what it's about most of the time.
Yes.
I remember families from the Navy SEALs came in and they were just, the partners felt alone, isolated, cut off. They felt powerless. They couldn't reach their partners who were at that time Navy SEALs, but I've seen it first responders as well. And the marriages are the pain and the conflict.
We'd say we're being thoughtful of our partners or our families, but in fact, it's a way for us to avoid.
A lot of times. And I remember that came up every time.
It did.
I didn't see too many partners that said, I don't want to hear this, I can't stand it, I don't want to.
Yeah, no, the partners say, where are you? When you're home, you're not even here.
Talk to me. How many times do we hear people, wives, and but most of the time it's wives or partners saying, talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
I need to hear where you are. You're cutting me off.
Yeah. Yeah, I can tell you're not doing well, and I need to know what's going on. I want to know.
And or you're not here.
Yeah.
And Steve mentioned earlier, I was talking about Lone Survivor. The other movie that came out, remember, was called American Sniper, right? That was a core, and that's a true story. In fact, I know because we were involved with the SEALs at that time. The guy who's incredible, it was Kyle.
Chris Kyle.
Chris Kyle.
Mm-hmm.
And in the movie portrayed it, he went on so many missions and had seen so much trauma that he couldn't relate to his wife. He couldn't relate to his kids.
She was if I remember right, she was particularly verbal about that. She was really clear. I don't think she thought she was doing something wrong, and she really spoke up about it.
But she couldn't reach him.
But she still couldn't reach him.
No. I think one of the themes in that story is how unreachable Chris Kyle became.
How he became.
And his wife loved him.
Yeah.
And he loved her too. But he couldn't relate to her anymore. He couldn't relate to home life. He saw everything as war zone.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one of the parts in the movie where he was at a community gathering with the kids, and he saw a dog playing, and they were roughhousing, and it triggered off something about what he had seen in Afghanistan, and he went to kill the dog. And he scared everybody in the whole party. And his wife had to jump in. She screamed. He was kind of in a different place. He didn't even know what he was doing.
Right.
And she jolted him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when he finally considered getting a little help. It wasn't very effective help as far as I'm concerned. But we've seen this too many times. She couldn't reach him. I've had friends that we had one on our show who's very transparent, Randy.
Yes,
Randy.
Yeah.
And I remember us talking about after being in, was it Afghanistan or
it was either
Kazakhstan?
It was Iraq or Syria. He was up in that area.
But he had been out in the front lines for a long time. And he had a lovely wife at home. She loved him.
Mm-hmm.
I was there when he came back, and she was crying. she couldn't get him to relate.
Yeah.
And he had a good life. They love each other.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful woman, have a good life.
She
And he
totally supports what he's doing.
and he could not. He says, "How can I can't even turn on the water where I've been, and I come home and I can't even relate to having running water
That I can drink.
and I can drink." And that's right. I remember we talked about it right here on the show.
Yeah.
And he could not relate to Sharon, and she's a really good woman.
Yeah.
He knew it, but you know what? I saw him. He was a blank.
Yeah.
He couldn't. She was in tears right with me. She says, "I can't. How do I reach him? I can't reach him."
Mm-hmm.
She reached out to me, and I looked at. He was blank.
Yeah.
And he says, "How can I relate to all this after I've been, wherever he was, and Kazakhstan, and seeing all the horrible trauma that these people have gone through, and I come home and I have this beautiful wife and good life."
Yep.
It's a survivor's guilt. He could not get beyond it.
And in our metaphor, he has pushed the pause button and he's still there. He has not gotten that taken care of.
Right. And I remember he admitted it because did we have him on a second show?
We did.
And that was a while later.
It was a while later, and he said, yes, it took me a certain amount of time to be able to come back and really be home and let down.
And he did.
But he does. He says, I know I do it. He says, it just takes a while sometimes.
And he was very transparent about it.
Yeah.
He's an amazing guy. Spent a lot of time on the front line with our troops, with survivors of war. Just amazing. Refugee camps.
Yeah.
He's an amazing man. But he's not that different from first responders, caregivers, Navy SEALs, Marines, you name it. That ability to just let it go and come back to our lives and just relate and work through our pain and just be. That's not that easy.
No, it's not.
And one of the things in personal relationships, and you and I know it because we've seen this with people, is they become a threat. What's the threat? The threat is intimacy and closeness.
Yes.
Brings a lot out of people. They begin to soften, they begin to let down, and they can't handle it because where they've been, that's a dangerous thing to do.
It is. It's a vulnerability that they can't indulge when they're on the front line.
And their nervous system has been distorted. It's been stuck. It's stuck. So in other words, their natural intuitive responses are still locked into
Hyper alert.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And
Yep.
it just doesn't shift.
Yeah.
So you come home to a relationship with this love and caring, that's a threat. Because all of a sudden, people begin to feel.
Mm-hmm.
And they begin to feel what they've been through. They begin to feel what's been locked up inside of them. And they don't want to.
They can feel like they're going to spiral out of control.
They're afraid.
They can feel overwhelmed.
And it is overwhelming.
It can be.
If it's cumulative, it is. So we need to put the message out that this can be worked out. And the message is there's a time and a place to let these things get discharged and cleansed. And your nervous system will come back to a relatively normal state where it can shift and it doesn't feel like it's got to be on hyper alert. It takes time, it takes work. It is doable. But we're seeing too much of the opposite, where folks don't do it. And let me tell you, you can sit there and counsel them all day long. And one of the things we've found, and you know this, you've been there with me, is well, they'll yes you to death because they're so obedient, but when it really comes down to it, those emotions are so loud and so overwhelming that the energy behind it is so intense that no matter how you counsel them, that's what they keep running up against, that locked up energy.
It's in their body. We talk about that frequently.
And we do, about caregivers.
Because it's essential.
It's so important for them to access, because your body holds the trauma.
Yeah, you've described the body as the reservoir of the unconscious. It holds all of those experiences and emotions, and it's a biological process. It's the way our bodies work. It's really a safety mechanism in our body to help us survive the very dangerous experiences that we go through. We've used the metaphor of a deer, and let's maybe come back to that here. But first, what we're going to do is Peter's going to have a cough drop, and I'm going to say, you've been listening to The Survivor's Guide to Life on KPCA Petaluma 103.3 FM. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to The Survivor's Guide to Life. I'm your host, Jenny Stevenson. In our last segment, we got into a little bit more of the direct relationship between trauma and high stress for first responders and how it affects their relationships. We were talking about the desire not to deal with some of these emotions because they can be so overwhelming. We may say we don't want to burden the people we love, but really we just don't want to go through this ourselves, or first responders may not want to. We were talking just before the break about sort of our biological response to sort of a survival mechanism that's built into us when we encounter overwhelming threat. And how we go on. The first stage is a hyper alert stage, and how many first responders, it's a necessary stage in dealing with very difficult situations, but then how many first responders and others can get stuck in hyper alert and don't really know or understand the process of how to bring themselves back down to a normal state, and how an essential part of our work this has been through the years.
Yeah, well, you were talking just also, too, before the break, about the analogy of a deer being threatened. Well, their primitive nervous system and primitive brain is like ours. It's that part where we're very similar. And you're right, when they get that sense that they're in danger, their nervous system shifts into hyper alert. It's a survival mechanism, and they need to survive. But they don't have the cerebral, the prefrontal cortex, they don't have all of that to get in the way and think and rationalize, because when the threat is gone, they shake out all of that intense energy that went in that hyper alert response, and their nervous system it goes back to a more normalized, relaxed state, and they go back to eating, and you can see their eyes soften, the hair in the neck relaxes, and they go back to foraging, and just in the fields. I've seen it many times. They can do that. We have that same thing. The thing is, we can get stuck.
We can interrupt the process.
And that's where the problem is. And also, we're talking about first responders. We're also talking about military, and the training, muscle training is you're trained to react very quickly under dangerous situations.
To have it be almost instinctive.
It's built in. The training for Navy SEALs never stop training, and they're the thinkers. Those are the guys that really are put in all kinds of situations where they're trained to the gills, to as high as they can be. But you know what? They're also trained to adapt very quickly in dangerous situations. But the muscle memory, nervous system, and all is geared toward survival. And I remember when I was in the military with basic training, and I'll never forget it. And I wasn't a good soldier, everybody, so I wasn't like
disclaimer here.
Yeah, my friends, well, they were. I wasn't. But I went through infantry training, and I went through all of it in advanced infantry training. But one of the things I'll never forget, their training was so intense during the Vietnam era because they wanted us to survive.
They were trying to help
to help us survive, but it was brutal.
It was harsh, very harsh.
Extremely tough. And we went to situations, I didn't go, but everybody else did. I went to a reserve training unit. But I remember, man, when we got done with us, we were ready to fight.
I remember, too, you have shared an experience that you had where you were with your first wife, woken up in sleep, and your muscles had kicked in the way you're training, and horrified you.
Horrified me. Even in basic training, I was not, at that time in my life, I had an attitude toward authority, no question about it. And but I remember saying, I'm not going to let this get to me like it's everybody else, and I'm going to fight it off, and I'm not going to let them break me. Well, in the end, I'll never forget it. They broke me, and they were so happy that I got somebody had taunted me, and I just about killed them. I'll never forget how fast it happened. And I remember the drill sergeant standing there, letting it happen, and watching, and being so gleeful that Bernstein's been broke. We got him.
Yeah.
I didn't like it. I'm sorry I was like that.
No.
But you're right. When I went home on my first leave after 3 months, I don't remember, 4 months, and my first wife, I was sleeping, I was exhausted, and she tried to wake me. And I will never forget this. I couldn't believe it. I had her against the wall with my hand on her throat, and I wasn't even awake.
Yeah.
It was that fast. And I remember how terrified she was. I was sickened what had happened. And because I knew I remember swearing I'd never let this happen. It was in me. My nervous system was ready for battle. I was ready to go. I think this was after advanced infantry training. So it was longer than 3 months, the whole thing. It was about 6 months. But I remember I was appalled at myself.
And this is your story of this is what gives me, among other things, a lot of compassion for first responders, military service members who do, to their detriment, end up burying things because they're so afraid if they let anything out, they're going to do something horrific like that.
I know it. And we're doing this show because we have empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
Most of the folks that I know are very good people. First responders are the best as far as what they do. They're an extraordinary lot. Caregivers are extraordinary. And I look at that, and we're doing this because we have compassion, and we do understand. And we want to offer them a way of becoming resilient, that they don't have to stop being prepared for what they have to do, but they have to take care of themselves in between self-care and what forms it may take. That they have to learn to decompress that emotional baggage and the energy they've absorbed. And it's very important. Do I think they can just talk it through? I don't. I wish I remember debriefing a number of first responders that I knew and thinking to myself, this isn't it. But I'm certainly not going to undermine what they're coming to me. That was a huge step. And I don't mean just clinically, but as an expert on what I knew they came to me that way, but I didn't want to undermine anything because it was such a big step for them even to talk to me, an outsider.
Yeah.
But they trusted me. But I'm saying to myself, if they don't get this stuff decompressed and discharged, they're going to get sick. Do you know every person that did this has cancer? I know them for a long time. They did develop cancer. And I knew it would happen. You can't carry that kind of energy and let it keep building and tough it out to where it's not going to take a toll. Some of the folks I know, it did not break up their marriages. I mean, they were. I can attest to that. Their children who grew up have trouble. I know some of those
Children are
kids.
affected too.
Oh yeah.
I want to jump back to a word you used, which is decompress. This is part of what we were talking about earlier about after you have been in hyper alert, you are charged up to handle the emergency in front of you, and you need to then have this skill to be able to come back to a more normal state. And we've used the word decompressing.
And you need somebody to help you with it. It's very hard to do yourself.
It's not something anyone taught you when you left the service. It's something we have worked hard to offer to people who come to us.
We specialize in trauma recovery, and I'm glad we do. It's tough to convey to them this is essential. If you stay resilient, it protects your family, it protects you. It gives hope for you to actually become even better as a team member, as a husband or wife, as a mother or father, and for somebody to assimilate into civilian life more easily. It's very protective. And I've been doing this work for almost 50 years, and if I didn't do what I do to take care of myself, there's no way I would have lived, because the bombardments are so intense.
It's a similar bombardment, the work that you and I have done, you for many more years. It's a similar emotional, intensive bombardment to military service or first responder service.
It's tough work, and I mean, I don't want to take anything away from anybody who's on the front lines of danger and doing great work. but we've been on the front lines of our kind of work, and it's tough. Not all of my colleagues have made it. Not all of them lived. It was too much for them. They burned out or passed away.
I know your mentor did not live
No,
a
he
full
died when I think he
lifespan.
was 56 years old. He died.
Yeah.
And he was only one. I know others have too. But I really took a very active made an active commitment to make sure. The reason is I wanted to protect my family. That's my relationship with my wife and my son. But that really was important to me because I knew how much damage I could do. So for me, it was a life commitment. If I'm going to protect what I have, then I better take care of myself and I better figure this thing out. And I'm carrying it right through to this day now that my wife is at the end of her life. It's very traumatic and very distressing. But one thing that I do carry with me, and people from hospice say, you know, you're a professional at self-care. You know how to do that. So they're right to a degree, but I'm not going to take it all away because it's so distressing for me to see my wife.
You're human.
I'm very human.
Yeah.
But they're right about one part of it. I do know how to deal with it. And I'm not saying it goes easily. I go through everything. Excuse me. That everyone else goes through, except I come through the other side, and I come back on my feet, and I keep moving forward. I know that if I didn't know how to decompress and work with the energy and the trapped trauma in my body that I've absorbed, that either was my own or absorbed from others, I wouldn't make it. Relationships would suffer tremendously, and so would I, because I'd be in so much darn pain. So I know what I'm talking about, but I'm not as an expert, as a fellow human being who's an empath, one of those empathetic people who've been through a lot in their lives. Well, I'm one of them, and that's why I can relate to a Navy SEAL. That's why I can relate to a first responder or a Marine. I look at my whole life as a battle zone and a war zone. The work I do, the things I've been through. I've had so many traumas in my life that I've come through. Just reading these newsletters that we wrote and we dusted off, I see one of them describing another trauma I've been through, and a wonderful man, Pastor Ken Gage, who passed away. We did a little
A tribute.
A tribute to him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he came into my life at one of those terrible, traumatic times. And he awakened, and it was already happening, my spiritual side of things, and I wasn't exactly a spiritually engaged man, but he was right. And that began to also emerge through all of this. So one of the things that you can say is that there's so many good things that can come out of these difficulties.
That's one of the main themes of our podcast, is out of adversity can come growth, healing, hope, purpose, so many things that are worth having in life.
It's so transformative. It's like you'll never be the same person again.
And you'll be more the person you were meant to be.
Yes, and you'll have a lot deeper and have a lot more empathy for your fellow man. So I do believe that there's hope, and not only that, I think you can come at it for the better and better and better to prepare you for other challenges, and for first responders and for caregivers and for soldiers. I'm telling you, it's essential.
Yes.
But you got to have a safe place to do it.
Safe place and the skills to do it. And
Yeah.
we may come back and talk about that some more next time. All right. Let me go to saying that the Survivor's Guide to Life is made possible through a grant from Sonoma Coast Trauma Treatment, a 501c3 public charity that relies entirely on donations from people like you. If our podcast has helped you, please consider donating to sctraumatreatment.org. Also, you could like us on Facebook for the Survivor's Guide to Life and Instagram. We would like to provide this resource, these articles that we have on relationships and trauma. If you contact me, Jenny, at bernsteininstitute.com and give me your email address, I would be really happy to send you a copy of these. I think they would be excellent. I think they are so good. We were just talking again about how valuable they are. So that again is Jenny at bernsteininstitute.com. Thank you so much for listening, and please join us again next time.
We wish you all well.